welcome to a David Icke Connector special. Today we're going to be talking about the coronavirus. First of all, what I'd like to do is just get David, my dad, thoughts on the coronavirus and what you think this is all about.
Well, when anything like this happens, Gaz, my first question is the question I think everyone needs to ask, and that is who benefits? Because one of the great things to remember is a very old phrase. He who most benefits from a crime is the one most likely to have committed it. And if you put that in the perspective of what I've been writing about and talking about for 30 years, which is a global cult, that's what it is, with an agenda to create a global Orwellian state of total centralized dictatorship and control in every area of our lives. Now, you can't just do that out of nothing. You have to have excuses to do it, which seem plausible to a large number of people. And this is where the phrase I coined back in the 90s comes from, which is problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem or the illusion of one, depending on what it is. You then tell the public the version of the problem you want them to believe, and you want them to either say do something or at least accept that something must be done, even if they don't like it. And number 3 stage in problem, reaction, solution is then you offer the solutions to the problems you have covertly created. And I, of course, have written about many, many subject areas and scenarios which would allow a problem of a global nature, because if you want to create a global control state, then you need global problems to which you can offer global solutions. And there are many and various, but one of them that I've highlighted over the years is a pandemic, which ticks every single box of problem, reaction, solution in terms of creating a Orwellian global state. We know, of course, that China is an authoritarian, tyrannical dictatorship. But if you look at what's happened since the coronavirus outbreak, they have excelled themselves, even by their standards, in terms of imposition of the state on the people. And we're already seeing, as it starts to seep out into other areas of the world, the authority and the public reaction, which both of them are incredibly predictable. You are seeing more and more suggestions that an authoritarian approach is necessary to protect the public from the virus. I'm even reading articles, Gaz, one I remember by a couple of idiot academics, that flying is so dangerous in terms of passing on the virus that only vaccinated people should be allowed to fly. And the potential for we must do this to protect you is enormous when you're dealing with a situation like this. And so who benefits from what is happening currently? Anyone that wants the excuse to impose more and more dictatorship on the public globally. And it's all, like everything in this conspiracy, it's a psychological game. And the human psychology that is mercilessly manipulated, absolutely in what we're seeing now, is this what appears to be innate fear of death, which comes from an innate fear of the unknown. And so the potential for imposing a global Orwellian lockdown is not only enormous in terms of the excuses to do it, but you're going to get massive public support to do it. Because they're going to be saying, indeed, you're starting to see it. Do anything, just basically save us. And so we have this this cocktail of psychology, which is potentially a precursor to a massive expansion of public control. You also have, in this agenda that I've been pointing out for 30 years, and particularly I've emphasized it since the financial crash of 2008, that there is a plan for a massive financial crash, much bigger than 2008, to provide a problem reaction solution to impose a whole new economic order. And when you look at what is being suggested as a solution to climate change, this human-caused climate change hoax, they are saying we need a new economic order. Now, what are we seeing already in the early stages of this coronavirus situation? We're seeing big impacts on the financial markets, and potentially because what has been happening for a long time is that these major corporations and companies have been moving their production and becoming dependent for their supply line on China. So now China's in upheaval. That is having a knock-on effect big time to the rest of the world, and potentially it could get a hell of a lot worse. So wherever you look, you have this this potential of problem reaction solution to impose the very Orwellian global state that that I've been warning was planned. And the other thing that you have in a situation where we've got this problem, so we have to impose this authoritarianism, is that even when the quote problem is passing, the authoritarian impositions to deal with the problem don't get rolled back, or at least don't get rolled back to where they were before. So in terms of who benefits, there's only one group of people who benefit from what is happening, and that's anyone that wants to have an excuse to create or move further towards this global Orwellian state. And you know, I've highlighted over the years in the books insiders who've actually talked about one of their plans is to release viruses into the public arena. There was a guy called Dr. Richard Day, who was a big Rockefeller insider, and he told a meeting of pediatricians in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1969, a series of things that all have happened or are happening in detail. And one of them was that they were going to introduce diseases to the population via inoculation. And we shouldn't forget either that, you know, I've talked at length about the Project The New American Century, this organization set up in America, which listed the countries for regime change and said we have to have a massive event like a Pearl Harbor to justify it. And they said this in September 2000. And a year later, they had 9/11, which justified the list of countries that have been pursued and many overthrown ever since. But there was something else in that document, which, again, could well relate to the current situation. And to give you the exact quote, the Project The New American Century document talked about the development of advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes and may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. And the people that wrote this are still walking the streets and not under psychiatric care, because before people dismiss any of this stuff, they need to grasp the scale of psychopath and psychopathic evil that actually we're dealing with in terms of what's driving the direction of the world. And we'll get into this as we go along in this chat, but the United States, a laboratory in Wuhan, China, where this outbreak is supposed to have started, seems to have done, and in other countries around the world, including Britain, Porton Down, the infamous Porton Down, they have biolabs that are developing these very biological warfare agents. And so there are many things we need to take into account in terms of what's going on, and not just accept the official version.
Interestingly, with the Project for the New American Century, I mean, they spoke about regime change in China. And as we spoke about when we had a chat about Iran, I mean, you don't necessarily have to have a war to win a war, if that makes any sense. So with China, you'd think regime change, so what they're going to do, they're going to invade China. Maybe they have, you know.
Well, I think to put this into perspective and where we will probably go with this in terms of where did it come from, it's important that we realize that at the level of this global cult that I'm talking about, there are no countries. They want global control. You may be an American member of this cult, or a British member of this cult, or a Chinese member of this cult, but you have no allegiance to American people, British people, or Chinese people. Your allegiance is to the cult and its agenda for total global control. And so if you look at it from this level, say, for instance, it turned out that the Chinese regime released this virus on the world. People would say quite rightly, well, why would they do that on the Chinese people? If they were truly representing the Chinese people and cared about the Chinese people, then they wouldn't do that. But if you're operating this global cult in which you in China are the same as you in America and you in Britain and you in France, etc., then you would do that, because whether they're Chinese or American or whatever, it doesn't matter to you. There's just the human target population. And there are many instances or indications, a better word, that actually this virus did not happen naturally and may well have emerged from this Wuhan biological warfare laboratory.
Whenever something like this happens, whether it be a potential pandemic or whether a terror attack, I always look out for sort of a few telltale signs. So if there's been a bomb gone off, then have they found a passport? Did someone shout Allah Akbar? Were they on the MI5 or the CIA watch list or whatever? You know, there's all these things with Princess Diana. The cameras were off; they didn't work. These little coincidences, and they're a telltale sign. And there's a load of them with this, isn't there?
Yeah, loads of coincidences. I should also mention before I go into that I talked there about the Project for the New American Century and the demand to develop biological warfare agents to target specific genotypes. Well, according to people who are operating in this whole biological arena, since 9/11, i.e. basically that document, America has spent about $100 billion plus on developing biological warfare agents, and according to them, it's rising at a rate of about $5 billion a year. There are many of these labs in America, and that, like I say, in Britain, and certainly the Wuhan one in China. And that's number one, Gaz, in the coincidences. This is a biolab, which is called level 4, and the level is the level of containment, the level of ability to contain these really lethal viruses that they're working with. And there's one in China, and it's in Wuhan. And Wuhan comes up again and again and again. For instance, they had a military games just before this coronavirus broke out, where there were 10,000 military sportsmen and women from around the world, all over the world they came from. And there was a big team from the United States, and it was held in Wuhan. And at the same time that was going on, there was a simulation happening in which the usual suspects, like the World Economic Forum, this organization that meets in Davos in Switzerland every year. I mean, the World Economic Forum is just another term for the 1%, the elite of the elite. And also organizing this simulation was the John Hopkins organization in America, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, another massive 1% organization that is absolutely at the forefront of seeking to vaccinate the world. Now, what was this simulation? It was a simulation of a pandemic of a coronavirus, and how the reaction and the response would unfold if it happened. This was happening 6 weeks, this simulation, before the real outbreak began in China. And you can see reports of this on the internet. These were military people and people from the United Nations, from corporations, etc. The Centers for Disease Control in America, the CDC. And they were discussing how they would respond to a coronavirus pandemic 6 weeks before the reports came out about China. And among the things they were very focused upon was censoring anyone who was challenging the official narrative of the pandemic, and how they would have to target, quote, anti-vaxxers, because, of course, part of a problem reaction solution in a pandemic is to produce the solution of a vaccine. And if you get people so wound up in fear, oh my God, then not only are they going to accept even compulsory vaccination against the virus, but they are going to have no problem with those that don't want to be vaccinated being forced to do so, or at least isolated if they don't. And so it's something big time to watch as this unfolds. Watch the vaccine, because they're already saying, oh, we're working to develop a vaccine. I would be staggered if that vaccine doesn't already exist. And there is another coincidence worth mentioning, because Bill Gates said that his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was actually based on the Rockefeller Foundation. Because what happens is these foundations, these tax-exempt foundations, tax-exempt of course, what they do is they set themselves up as philanthropic organizations as a vehicle to fund this global agenda in the name of, oh, we're just trying to help people. Hence, you've got the vaccination obsession of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And a researcher friend of mine called Bill Ryan sent me this week a document, and it's from the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's from 2010, and it was a document that was headed Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. And what it did was describe a series of scenarios, their version of the World Economic Forum simulation, in which they looked at what would happen in various scenarios. And among them was a scenario for a pandemic involving an influenza strain. And they describe in their scenario of what would happen how the economy would be devastated, shops would empty. Of course, we've seen all the panic buying in places like Italy. Once, oh, coronavirus, buy everything. And I'll just read you part of it because it's, I think, very relevant to current events and the potential of current events. It, first of all, praises China in this scenario, the Chinese government, for quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders. And, of course, the Chinese government has reacted in that way. So it goes on to describe how, in this scenario, totalitarianism was introduced in countries of the West in response to this virus. Quote, to protect citizens from risk and exposure. And it continues like this. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from mandatory wearing of face masks, which are basically useless, so I am told by authority, to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, the more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. That's what I mentioned earlier. They say, oh, we've got to do this because of this. And then when this comes to an end, oh, but we're not going to roll them back now. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics to transnational terrorism to environmental crises, all of which are being pushed by this cult via its various fronts and agencies, by the way, and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. At first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager, as I've mentioned, for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms: biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter regulations of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interests. In many developed countries, enforced cooperation with a suite of new regulations and agreements slowly but steadily restored both order and, importantly, economic growth. So here you have these coincidences, and there are others, of Wuhan having this biolab at a level, this level 4, where they deal with and develop biological warfare agents. You have the simulation 6 weeks before by Gates and the World Economic Forum of a coronavirus and what would happen, and what they said would happen is playing out. You've got the Rockefeller organization proposing a scenario and an outcome very, very similar. And so it goes on. And you also have this Harvard professor who was involved in this whole area of chemistry and biology, who was arrested for lying about his contacts with the Chinese in relation to the whole biological arena. And he was paid a vast sum to set up a research center in a university in Wuhan. So this story, this official narrative, has a very a long list of holes which need to be highlighted and taken into account when we are seeking to understand where this came from and why it has been introduced. Because I don't think that it's happened by accident at all.
And another sign for me as well that there's something behind it, there's a scam being played, is that the numbers don't add up with the hysteria. And I mean, you know, media outlets are always going to try and sell fear porn. It's what they do. It gets clicks, it gets some advertising revenue. But at the same time, I think it's, at the time of recording, it's around about 2,800 killed by the coronavirus. When you put that alongside 650,000 people a year from flu, it doesn't add up to the hysteria for me. And I have a couple of friends that are GPs, and I've spoken to them about it, and they're the same. They're like, well, I don't get it. It's not a big deal. To them, it's nothing.
But this is the point. We don't know yet how dangerous this is. You're quite right on the current death rate that we know about. Then there are many more things to be more serious in terms of health. Absolutely. But the point is that because this is a psychological game, the whole conspiracy is a psychological game, it doesn't matter in terms of problem, reaction, solution and changing society to protect the public, whether it is a lethal danger or whether they're just hyping it. Because as long as the people believe it's a danger, you'll get the same reaction, which allows you to impose your solution. So at this stage, I'm not going to say I think it came from here or it came from there. I don't think it was this whole thing is happening naturally or by accident. Absolutely not. Exactly what it is and where it came from, we've just got to look at the evidence as it unfolds and make a decision. But there is a guy that has been talking a lot in interviews, which you can see on the internet. His name's Francis Boyle. Now, he's a professor of international law at the University of Illinois, and he drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act, or Terrorist Act, in 1989, when it was passed by the Bush administration. Now, he's been talking about these biolabs, and this designation is known as BSL. BSL being biosafety level. And he's saying that these BSL levels 3 and levels 4, which is the Wuhan laboratory, there is no scientific reason, he says, for their existence except the engineering of biological warfare agents. So exactly what it is and exactly the nature of it, we don't know for sure, but we do know that a biological warfare agent laboratory was in Wuhan, where the outbreak is located to. And the original official story that it came from a wet market of animals being sold like bats, etc., absolutely does not stand up to scrutiny, because a significant number of the early cases had no connection whatsoever to that wet market. So there are many questions, but there are things we are now beginning to know, and not least that biological warfare laboratory was right in the epicenter of where it began. And this is a quote from the US Department of Health and Human Services about this biosafety level 4 laboratory system. It says, biosafety level 4, BSL 4, is the highest level of biosafety precautions and is appropriate for work with agents that could easily be aerosol transmitted within the laboratory and cause severe to fatal disease in humans for which there are no available vaccines or treatments. So that laboratory with that background was in the epicenter. Now, this guy, Francis Boyle, he reckons that this coronavirus strain, because loads of coronavirus strains of different kinds, was an engineered, or is an engineered bio weapon that escaped from Wuhan by whatever means, accident or design. And he has looked at papers, he says, that have investigated this whole coronavirus. And he says that he found that it has been engineered to have what is known as gain of function. And gain of function means it's been weaponized. It's been engineered, turbocharged to have a greater effect on humans. So this all has to be taken into account, despite efforts to censor it all, when we're looking at what this is about and where it came from. And one other area is the World Health Organization. This Wuhan lab is designated by the World Health Organization, and according to Francis Boyle, they would absolutely know what it's involved with and would be, in his words, quote, in on it. And of course, the World Health Organization, I've talked about this and written about this in the books for decades, was created via the Rockefellers, here we go again, and the Rothschilds and this global web as a central point for dictating matters of global health. And it is a deeply, deeply corrupt organization that is overseeing and putting out the statements and the official narrative about this coronavirus, the very statements and the very position and narrative that is increasingly being protected through censorship of other points of view. Now, the guy who's Director General of the World Health Organization at the moment is a guy called Tedros. Now, he's an interesting chap because the World Health Organization is a political organization. I'm not talking about everybody who works for it. I'm talking about the hierarchy. Now, this Tedros was a health minister in Ethiopia, and he was a Politburo Bureau member of a Marxist organization that has been very much part of the government of Ethiopia for a long time. In fact, Tedros was exposed on a number of occasions of covering up cholera epidemics in Ethiopia, which is just the guy you want, really, to be running the World Health Organization. Tedros also, when he came to power as Director General, appointed Robert Mugabe, the mass murderer dictator from Zimbabwe, as a World Health Organization global ambassador on public health. And it was such an outrageous decision, he had to reverse it pretty damn quick. But you see the mentality of the guy who's actually head officially of the World Health Organization as this coronavirus scenario unfolds. And he is the man who said in recent times that he's praising the Chinese government for their transparency over the virus outbreak. But you would expect that because Tedros and the communist dictators of China share the same politics. And I'll just give you this one quote, again from Francis Boyle, about gain of function. Gain of function technology is DNA genetic engineering of a dangerous biological warfare substance. So whatever the nature of this coronavirus as it plays out, that Wuhan laboratory was dealing with stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things as well. I think like when you're trying to work out a reason, why have they done it, who's done it, when they've done it, how they've done it. Like you say, they're things that you're not going to know immediately. That stuff that will come out a little bit later, as you mentioned before, because China is such a closed society anyway, which doesn't help obviously. But at the same time, I look at it and I think, well, it's almost like about 8 birds with one stone, because you've got the smart cities that are sat empty in China as well, and I'm sure that that could be a reason as well, that you're moving people out of areas and moving them into the smart cities that are just sat empty, which, as you've been saying for years, is all part of the plan anyway. You take out the economy of China a hell of a lot. You can even take out parts of the world economy, bring in another giant crash and recession. There's so many different things that you can achieve by having this coronavirus, whether it's as dangerous as they say or whether it's not, and it's just fear.
Yeah. As I've been saying for years and years and years and years, and then some, China is the blueprint for the world. This global Orwellian fascistic state that this cult has been manipulating the world towards generation after generation is the blueprint is China. You see, in China, you've had a situation where you have a regime so authoritarian, such a fascistic regime, that it can do whatever it likes. So it can move this agenda on as fast as it bloody wants. Whereas in the West, where they're still pathetically trying to pay lip service to, oh, we're the land of freedom, they have to try to do it in a more subtle way, less subtle by the day, by the way, and kind of either bring the public with them or not have too much resistance. So it moves slower, though it's moving faster and faster, because the more power you get, the more power you can accrue. But China's the blueprint. And like I said earlier, people should just put aside borders. This cult doesn't have borders. And so it's not about Chinese people or what's good or whatever for Chinese people. It's about the agenda, and the blueprint is China. And what you've seen in China, like I said earlier, is the ranking up or the ratcheting up of the authoritarian nature of the state on a scale even surpassing anything we've seen even in China before. Why? Because we must protect the people from the coronavirus. So if you put the borders aside and just look at the Chinese regime as a dot or a strand in the global web, then this starts to make more sense, because there is a reason why these various scenarios of a pandemic praise China for the way they dealt with it, either, in theory or literally, in terms of locking everything down and imposing a state will. I mean, they're pulling people off the street, they're pulling people out of their houses, and this is what they want globally. And this situation gives them the potential to do that. What we as people need to do is stay calm. Very important, because once you start to panic, you stop thinking straight, and you come purely from emotion, and you come from the survival instinct. And your survival instinct will say, do anything, God, just let me survive. We need to stay calm and just look at this rationally and calmly, and then we'll see things that panic will not see. And like I've said many times, know the outcome and you'll see the journey. The outcome they want is a global Orwellian dictatorship. I say Orwellian beyond anything that even Orwell envisaged. And once you know that, you can see the steps towards it. And this situation provides endless potential to make many steps very quickly.
Absolutely. And another point, just briefly, you've mentioned before about the kind of the war on the elderly. How Dr. Richard Day talked about the demise pill and these various things, how euthanasia is far more accessible now, and there's all the, people see a good side of that, and that's what they sell, obviously. But when you look at the figures for this, it's for sort of up to about the age of 19, there's no fatalities, is there? And then it slowly goes up. I think my age, I'm not going to tell you my age, is about 0.2%, and then it gets to about 8% fatality, doesn't it? Mortality rate as it gets higher. And you look at it, and we shared a news story on the site this morning about how basically the NHS have come out and said here in England that old people are bottom of the list.
Yeah, I mean, that's funny because, as you know, I'm just finishing a new book, and I've been writing about this coronavirus as part of that book this very morning, actually. And one of the points I was making, exactly the point you've just made. There is part of this plan is to vastly reduce the population. And again, I've been writing about that for decades, but particularly the elderly. See, this cult sees humans as just a resource, and you work for the cult, although you don't realize you are. And once you can't, from the cult's point of view, you're surplus to requirement. I think Henry Kissinger talked about useless eaters. And so once you've finished your cycle of contribution to this cult's web, then they basically want rid of you. And you're absolutely right to point out, as I say, I've been writing about it this morning, that this coronavirus, overwhelmingly, the death rate is with older people. And you mentioned Dr. Richard Day. One of the things he said in 1969 was that they were planning a situation where people would get to a certain age and then they would take what he called the demise pill. And he described it in detail. I mean, the man was completely mad, but he was articulating something that's real. How they would have a party and people and the children and the parents, they would all, say, oh, mom and dad, they did a great job, thank you very much. And they'd have a good time. And then they'd take the demise pill, the older parents, and disappear, or grandparents. And that would be it. These people are completely insane, but very clever in the way they manipulate human psychology. And so you're seeing all these attacks on old people. You mentioned one there with the NHS, but we've also had these highly controversial, and so they bloody should be, care pathways where doctors who, in their opinion, say the older person is going to is basically in the last the last stages of life, that they stop giving them drugs and they stop doing all the things that would keep them alive, and they just let them die. Now, people, not least through pressure from their loved ones, who've had their parents or grandparents taken off this care pathway, the parents or grandparents have lived for a long time beyond what the doctor said, oh, we're going to let them die now because they're in the last throes of life. Well, actually, they weren't. And they said, oh, well, we're going to change this now. We're going to have that be very controversial. But the same things are going on. We already know that. There is this targeting of old people. And I would also mention this, this coronavirus has not gone that far yet. But the members of the Iranian government have got it. Now, what are the statistical chances of that? At a time when the Iranian government is being targeted by the Americans and the Israelis, etc. And when I'm talking about this, I'm looking at possibilities, not being certain of saying this is what's happened, this is what's happening. Anyone who says that absolutely know what's happening is kidding themselves or kidding you at this stage. But we can look at evidence and say, well, it does actually look like that, or at least we should consider this or consider that. And one thing I think we should consider is that this virus is being possibly released in other places. And I find it an extraordinary coincidence that actual members of the Iranian government should get this virus at this stage of its apparent expansion. And one other thing, that there are some suggestions on the internet that 5G could be involved. What I would say is two things about that. And again, I'm not saying this is what's happening. I'm saying just put it in the mix. Every single emotion, every thought, every virus, everything in this reality is a frequency. It has a unique frequency. So a virus is, if you like, biological, but on another level, it's a particular frequency. And the human body is a frequency field at its deeper levels. And you can affect the frequency field of the body with external technological frequencies. And again, I'm not saying this is what's happening, but it is possible to transfer the frequency of a virus into the human energy field from that technological point of view. And the other thing that 5G, and not least sitting in Wi-Fi and stuff all day, does is it, because the body is on one level a wave field, an electromagnetic field, a wave field of information, anything of a wave electromagnetic nature that disrupts that field is going to manifest in some form as either, quote, physical or psychological dis-ease, disharmony. So again, I see people, these fact checkers and stuff, God help us, who just dismiss it. Oh, not possible. Well, it is possible. I'm not saying it's happened. It's possible, and it needs to go in the mix.
Yeah, you fact checkers like Snopes.
Oh, don't start me.
If someone uses Snopes in an argument, they've lost, in my opinion. I'm out. It's as bad as Wikipedia.
I was reading one this morning. It's a British one, calls itself a charity. Was it Fact Check or something like that? And it was saying there is no evidence that 5G has a detrimental effect on human health. Well, first of all, there's been no studies. The telecommunications industry admitted this. Zero in questioning on Capitol Hill when they were asked, how much money have you spent on investigating the effects on humans and human health of 5G? And they said nothing. So if you don't test something for a problem, you're going to say there's no evidence of a problem. I mean, that's the way they do it, because if they did, and that was officially published, 5G would never have been allowed to be played out. And independent studies have invariably said it's a problem. So we need to put that in the mix as well when we're trying to understand the possibilities of what this is, where it came from, and where it's designed to take us.
Yeah, the list of possibilities is yeah, as long as you're armed. But I think we're probably both of the opinion that, as you said earlier, it's not natural. And even, people like the New York Times are reporting that scientists are saying that it's not natural. So I guess we'll just see where it goes.
One of the other points that some people are making, and this Professor Boyle is among them, is that this coronavirus strain was actually stolen from North America, either a Canadian laboratory in Winnipeg or an American laboratory. America has many of these BSL-4 laboratories. And I have written, again, a lot about the infiltration of the Chinese regime into academia, etc., and science in America to steal data, steal know-how, and in this case, possibly steal viruses of a kind that can be weaponized or have already been weaponized. There are no borders with the cult. There's just a world they want to control.
Should we try and regain this chat in a month and see where we are in a month, and see, because in the last month it's kind of grown and grown. I do wonder where it's going to go, if it's going to taper off, or whether they're really going to up the ante.
Well, we hope it's going to taper off. Yeah. We've seen things like this before with Ebola and SARS and all these, or we're all going to die scenarios. So it may well taper off. But if it doesn't, then the potential for problem, reaction, solution on a global level is immense. So it'd be a very good idea to come back in 4 weeks, and hopefully we say, oh, gee.
Yeah, thank God for that. We'll have a beer and a celebration, yeah.
Yeah, but and not just because of the virus. I'm not saying that just because of the virus. I'm saying it because of the potential for advancing this global state very quickly. And if they haven't got the excuse, then they're not going to be able to do it as fast as if they have. So it'd be a very good idea to do that and see where we are, because I'm open to all possibilities, but we need to put all possibilities into the mix and not just accept the one possibility that officialdom wants us to believe.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, remain calm.
very calm. Once in any of these situations, economic collapse, whatever the scenario may be, we have to stay calm, because there's no benefit in panic. There is none. There is only downside in panic. In calmness, you retain the ability to think calmly and rationally and what have you. Whereas when you panic, you're
an easy target.
You're a violin string, basically, once you panic, to their orchestra.
Yeah, if you're panicking, you'll spend €30 on a face mask that was about 80p 2 weeks ago.
Well, that's another thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Bezos has done all right out of it so far, hasn't he?
I guess there's always some good that comes out of it for some people. In that sense, we'll just up the ante on everything that people think they need. Oh yeah, hey, I'm a businessman, I'm a winner, and all that stuff. But that was predictable as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Calmness is absolutely vital, and then we can see through the crap.
Absolutely. Okay, right. We'll have a chat in a month, then, Dad.
All right, mate. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, mate.
Bye.